The rope cut deep into John McCain's shoulders as Vietnamese guards yanked his arms behind his back. His bones cracked under the pressure. The interrogator's voice echoed through the concrete chamber. "You will confess your crimes against the Vietnamese people." This wasn't an isolated incident. Between 1964 and 1973, over 700 American servicemen became prisoners of war in North Vietnam. What happened to them behind those prison walls would haunt survivors for decades. The psychological warfare didn't just break bodies, it shattered minds. October 26, 1967, Lieutenant Commander John McCain's A-4 Skyhawk screamed toward its target in downtown Hanoi. At 3,000 feet, a Soviet surface-to-air missile tore through his right wing. The plane went into an uncontrolled dive. McCain pulled the ejection handle. The force broke his right leg in 3 places, his left arm and his right arm. He plummeted unconscious into Truc Bac Lake. When he surfaced, Vietnamese civilians were already swimming toward him. They dragged him to shore, where an angry crowd had gathered. The beatings started immediately. Rifle butts crashed into his skull. Bayonets stabbed at his groin and ankle. Someone crushed his shoulder with a rifle butt. McCain drifted in and out of consciousness as the mob screamed for his death. But McCain wasn't alone in this nightmare. 2 years earlier, Commander James Stockdale had ejected from his A-4 over North Vietnam. His parachute malfunctioned, slamming him into the ground at high speed. He dislocated his left shoulder and broke his back. Vietnamese villagers found him within minutes. They bound his arms behind his back with rope so tight it cut off circulation. The villagers took turns beating him with sticks and rocks. Children threw stones at his head. By the time North Vietnamese soldiers arrived, Stockdale was barely conscious. Commander Jeremiah Denton's F-105 Thunderchief went down on July 18, 1965. His aircraft took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire over North Vietnam. The ejection seat fired, but Denton's parachute deployed late. He hit the ground hard, fracturing his shoulder and injuring his back. Local militia surrounded him before he could move. They stripped him naked and paraded him through villages like a trophy. The peasants spat on him, threw mud, and beat him with farming tools. The humiliation was calculated, designed to break his spirit before he even reached prison. The pattern was always the same. Capture meant immediate violence. Vietnamese civilians, driven by years of bombing campaigns, took out their rage on downed American pilots. The lucky ones stayed conscious long enough to remember the beatings. After the initial mob violence came the transport phase. Prisoners were loaded onto trucks or forced to march for days. They received no medical treatment for their injuries. Guards provided minimal food and water. The message was clear. You're no longer human. McCain spent 4 days in a Hanoi hospital, but it wasn't mercy. Vietnamese doctors set his broken bones without anesthesia. They wanted him alive for interrogation, not dead from his injuries. The medical care was torture disguised as treatment. During transport to prison camps, guards stripped prisoners of everything that connected them to their former lives. Dog tags, wedding rings, photographs, everything disappeared. They received prison uniforms or were forced to wear their torn flight suits. The systematic removal of personal identity had begun. Vietnamese propaganda teams filmed and photographed the captured Americans. These images would later appear in newspapers worldwide, showing American war criminals in Vietnamese custody. The prisoners had no idea they were being used as propaganda tools from the moment of capture. The psychological warfare started during transport. Guards told prisoners their families had forgotten them. They claimed America was losing the war and would never negotiate for their release. Some guards spoke English specifically to deliver these messages of hopelessness. Fellow prisoners sometimes witnessed each other's capture and transport. They watched friends disappear into the Vietnamese prison system, not knowing if they'd ever see them again. The uncertainty became another weapon against their mental state. Vietnamese interrogators began their work during the transport phase. They asked seemingly innocent questions about family, hometown, and military service. Prisoners didn't realize these conversations were intelligence-gathering sessions designed to find psychological pressure points. The journey to prison camp could take weeks. Prisoners were moved between temporary holding facilities, each one worse than the last. By the time they reached their final destination, many had already begun the psychological breakdown that would define their captivity. Guards used sleep deprivation during transport as a control mechanism. Prisoners were kept awake for days, making them more susceptible to interrogation and less likely to attempt escape. The exhaustion became a constant companion. Some prisoners tried to escape during transport, but the Vietnamese countryside offered no sanctuary. Local villagers had been instructed to capture any Americans they found. Escape attempts usually ended in severe beatings and tighter security measures. The transport phase served multiple purposes beyond simply moving prisoners. It was the first systematic attempt to break their will to resist. By the time American POWs reached places like the Hanoi Hilton, they had already experienced weeks or months of physical and psychological abuse. Vietnamese guards studied each prisoner during transport, looking for signs of weakness or strength. They identified potential collaborators and troublemakers. This information would later determine treatment in the prison camps. The moment of capture marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. These men had gone from flying combat missions to becoming pawns in a psychological war. They were never trained to fight. Their real battle for survival was just beginning. The gates of Hoa Lo prison slammed shut behind the new arrivals with a sound that would echo in their nightmares for decades. Built by the French in 1896, this fortress of concrete and steel had been designed to break the spirit of Vietnamese revolutionaries. Now, it would serve the same purpose for American prisoners of war. The Vietnamese called it Hoa Lo, meaning fiery furnace. The Americans had a different name for it, the Hanoi Hilton. But there was nothing remotely hospitable about this place. The moment prisoners stepped through those gates, they entered a world designed specifically to destroy human dignity. The prison layout was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Long corridors stretched between cell blocks, creating an atmosphere of endless confinement. Guards could watch prisoners from multiple angles, ensuring constant surveillance. The architecture itself was a weapon, designed to make inmates feel trapped, observed, and powerless. Individual cells measured roughly 7 feet by 7 feet. Some were even smaller. McCain found himself crammed into a space barely large enough for his broken body. The concrete walls wept with moisture during the humid season, creating a constant dampness that bred disease and despair. The ceiling was too low for a grown man to stand upright. Prisoners had to crouch or sit, adding physical discomfort to their psychological torment. This wasn't an accident. Every aspect of the cell design was calculated to create maximum discomfort and dependency. But the human inhabitants weren't the only occupants of these concrete boxes. Rats the size of small cats scurried through the cells at night, fighting prisoners for scraps of food. They carried disease and left droppings everywhere. Some prisoners tried to catch them for extra protein. Others simply learned to coexist with their furry cellmates. Cockroaches covered the walls in writhing masses. They crawled over sleeping prisoners, into their ears, and across their faces. The insects were so numerous that the walls seemed to move in the dim light. Prisoners developed a constant twitching reflex, brushing bugs off their skin even when none were there. Human waste became another daily horror. Prisoners received a small bucket for their toilet needs, but it was rarely emptied. The smell was overwhelming, especially during the sweltering summer months. Some cells had no bucket at all. Prisoners were forced to relieve themselves in corners, adding to the unbearable stench. The tropical climate turned the concrete cells into ovens during summer and freezers during winter. Temperatures inside could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit with no ventilation. Prisoners lay naked on the concrete floor, gasping for air in the suffocating heat. Their skin stuck to the hot concrete, leaving burns and sores. Winter brought different tortures. With no heating and minimal clothing, prisoners shivered uncontrollably in the damp cold. The concrete walls absorbed the chill, creating an environment that seemed to suck warmth from human bodies. Hypothermia became a constant threat. Humidity was perhaps the worst enemy. During monsoon season, the air became so thick with moisture that breathing felt like drowning. Clothes never dried, wounds never healed properly. Fungal infections spread across skin that remained perpetually damp. The humidity bred disease and made every other discomfort worse. Vietnamese guards introduced prisoners to the stocks, medieval leg irons that would become their constant companions. These iron shackles were clamped around ankles and secured to the cell floor or wall. The metal cut into flesh, creating infected wounds that never healed properly. Prisoners wore the stocks for months at a time. The iron restricted blood flow, causing feet and legs to swell grotesquely. Some men lost feeling in their extremities permanently. The constant weight and restriction made sleep nearly impossible, adding sleep deprivation to the list of tortures. The stocks served multiple purposes beyond physical restraint. They were a psychological weapon, making prisoners feel like animals chained in a cage. The constant clanking of metal against concrete created a soundtrack of captivity that drove some men to the edge of sanity. Sleep became another battleground in the war for prisoners' minds. Guards deliberately disrupted sleep schedules, conducting cell inspections at random hours. Bright lights blazed through the night, making rest impossible. Prisoners were awakened for interrogations or moved between cells without warning. The sleep deprivation was systematic and calculated. Exhausted prisoners were more likely to make mistakes during interrogations. They became more susceptible to psychological pressure and propaganda. Sleep, one of humanity's most basic needs, became a weapon in the hands of their captors. Some prisoners tried to create makeshift pillows from their clothing or shoes. Guards confiscated anything that might provide comfort. Sleeping on bare concrete became the norm, adding physical pain to the mental torture of sleeplessness. The constant noise made rest even more elusive. Guards shouted commands at all hours, metal doors slammed, chains rattled, other prisoners screamed during torture sessions. The cacophony of prison sounds became a form of audio torture, preventing the mind from finding peace even in brief moments of physical stillness. Ventilation was virtually non-existent in most cells. Small windows, when they existed, were blocked or positioned too high to provide relief. The air became stagnant and poisonous, filled with the smell of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. Breathing itself became a struggle for survival. Guards used the prison environment as a tool of control. They could make conditions slightly better or dramatically worse, depending on a prisoner's behavior. A small improvement in food or a brief respite from the stocks became powerful motivators for compliance. The Hanoi Hilton wasn't just a prison. It was a carefully designed machine for breaking human beings. Every aspect of daily existence was calculated to strip away dignity, hope, and resistance. The men who entered those gates would never be the same again. The metal bowl clanked against the concrete floor as the guard shoved it through the cell door slot. John McCain stared at the contents, a watery, greenish liquid that barely qualified as soup. Chunks of rotting pumpkin floated on the surface like diseased lily pads. This was breakfast, lunch, and dinner rolled into one pathetic meal. The Vietnamese had turned starvation into an art form. They provided just enough calories to keep prisoners alive, but nowhere near enough to maintain health or strength. The daily ration consisted of watery pumpkin soup, a small portion of rice, and occasionally a piece of fish so rotten it turned green around the edges. McCain weighed 180 pounds when he was shot down over Hanoi. Within 6 months, the scales showed 100 pounds. His ribs protruded through paper-thin skin. His face became a skull wrapped in flesh. The transformation was so dramatic that fellow prisoners sometimes didn't recognize each other after brief separations. The pumpkin soup was the foundation of this starvation diet. Vietnamese cooks boiled pumpkin rinds, the parts Americans would throw away, in large vats of water. The result was a thin, bitter liquid with almost no nutritional value. Prisoners learned to drink it slowly, trying to convince their stomachs they were actually eating something substantial. Rice came in portions so small they could fit in a prisoner's cupped palm. But this wasn't quality rice. It was the broken pieces and debris left over from processing. Often, the rice was infested with weevils and maggots. Hungry prisoners faced an impossible choice: eat the insects for protein, or go without the carbohydrates their bodies desperately needed. Most chose to eat the bugs. Protein was protein, regardless of the source. Prisoners learned to close their eyes and swallow quickly, trying not to think about what they were consuming. Some men actually looked forward to finding maggots in their rice. It meant extra nutrition in their starvation diet. Fish appeared on the menu once or twice a week, but calling it fish was generous. The pieces were usually heads, bones, and scraps that had been sitting in tropical heat for days. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of ammonia and decay that made prisoners gag. The flesh was often green with decomposition, crawling with flies and maggots. But hungry men ate it anyway. They picked around the obviously rotten parts and consumed what seemed edible. Food poisoning was common, adding dysentery and vomiting to their list of physical ailments. Yet they continued eating the putrid fish because the alternative was starving to death. Vitamin deficiencies ravaged prisoners' bodies within months. Scurvy caused their teeth to loosen and fall out. Their gums bled constantly, turning their mouths into sources of infection and pain. Simple cuts refused to heal, festering into open wounds that attracted flies and bred disease. Beriberi attacked their nervous systems. Prisoners lost feeling in their hands and feet. Some developed heart problems from thiamine deficiency. Night blindness became common. Men who had once flown complex aircraft couldn't see their hands in front of their faces after dark. The psychological impact of constant hunger was perhaps worse than the physical effects. Food became an obsession. Prisoners spent hours fantasizing about meals they'd eaten years earlier. They described elaborate dinners to each other in excruciating detail, torturing themselves with memories of abundance. Competition for food created moral dilemmas that haunted prisoners long after their release. When guards occasionally dropped extra scraps of bread or rice, starving men fought each other for the privilege of eating moldy crumbs. The shame of stealing food from a fellow prisoner weighed heavily on men who had once been officers and gentlemen. Rats became competitors in the daily struggle for survival. These rodents were often better fed than the prisoners, having access to garbage and food stores throughout the prison. Prisoners learned to move quickly when guards delivered their meager rations. Rats would steal food directly from their bowls if given the chance. Some prisoners tried to catch rats for additional protein. They fashioned crude traps from pieces of wire or clothing. A successful rat catch meant extra meat for days, though the psychological barrier of eating rodents was difficult for many to overcome. Desperation eventually won over disgust. The human body's response to starvation created additional torments. Prisoners' stomachs shrank to accommodate the reduced food intake, but the hunger pangs intensified. Their bodies began consuming muscle tissue and organ matter to survive. Hair fell out in clumps, skin became translucent and paper-thin. Mental effects of malnutrition compounded the psychological warfare. Starving prisoners had difficulty concentrating, making them more vulnerable during interrogations. Their memory suffered, causing some to forget important details about their families or military service. The fog of hunger made resistance more difficult. Vietnamese guards used food as a weapon of control. Prisoners who cooperated during interrogations might receive slightly larger portions or fresher ingredients. Those who resisted found their already meager rations reduced further. The threat of additional starvation became a powerful motivator for compliance. Guards sometimes ate full meals in front of starving prisoners, describing the taste and texture of fresh meat, vegetables, and rice. This psychological torture was designed to break down resistance and create resentment toward the American government that had supposedly abandoned them. The starvation wasn't accidental. It was a calculated strategy to weaken prisoners physically and mentally. By keeping them on the edge of death from malnutrition, Vietnamese captors ensured their prisoners remained dependent, compliant, and broken. Food became the ultimate weapon in their arsenal of human destruction. The Vietnamese had perfected torture into a science, but their most devastating weapon wasn't electric shock or bamboo splinters. It was rope. Simple, cheap rope that could dislocate shoulders, snap tendons, and break the human spirit more effectively than any medieval device ever invented. They called it the rope trick, though there was nothing magical about the agony it produced. Vietnamese interrogators had studied human anatomy and discovered exactly how to position rope and pulleys to inflict maximum pain without killing their victims. The technique was brutally efficient and left no permanent visible scars, perfect for a regime that claimed to treat prisoners humanely. The process always began the same way. Guards would drag a prisoner from his cell and force him to sit on a low stool in an interrogation room. His hands were tied behind his back with thin rope that cut into his wrists. Then came the pulleys, a simple mechanical system that turned human joints into instruments of torture. The interrogator would thread rope through pulleys mounted on the ceiling and walls. One end was tied to the prisoner's bound wrists, the other controlled by guards who could apply precise amounts of pressure. When they pulled, the prisoner's arms were yanked upward and backward, forcing his shoulders into positions the human body was never designed to endure. John McCain experienced this torture repeatedly during his years in captivity. His shoulders, already damaged from his ejection and subsequent beatings, couldn't withstand the unnatural stress. Guards would yank his arms until his shoulder blades nearly touched behind his back. The pain was so intense that prisoners often passed out within minutes, but unconsciousness brought no relief. Guards would splash water on the prisoner's face or slap him awake to continue the session. The rope trick was designed to keep victims conscious and aware of their agony. Vietnamese interrogators wanted prisoners to experience every second of their suffering. The physical damage was catastrophic. Shoulder joints separated under the pressure, creating injuries that would never fully heal. Tendons snapped like rubber bands stretched beyond their limits. Nerve damage caused permanent numbness and weakness in prisoners' arms and hands. McCain's arms never regained full mobility after repeated rope sessions. Vietnamese guards could adjust the torture's intensity with surgical precision. A slight pull created uncomfortable pressure. More force caused excruciating pain. Maximum pressure could dislocate both shoulders simultaneously, leaving prisoners hanging by their destroyed joints while guards asked questions about military operations or demanded propaganda confessions. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Prisoners knew the rope trick could be applied at any time for any reason. The threat of having their shoulders destroyed again became a constant source of anxiety. Some men broke down and confessed to imaginary crimes simply to avoid another rope session. Commander James Stockdale understood the rope trick's true purpose wasn't extracting military intelligence. It was breaking human beings. When Vietnamese filmmakers wanted to record propaganda footage of him confessing to war crimes, Stockdale made a desperate decision. He grabbed a wooden stool and beat himself in the face until his features were too swollen and bloody to be useful for propaganda. The self-inflicted wounds sent a clear message to his captors. He would rather destroy himself than cooperate with their psychological warfare. But this act of defiance came with consequences. Guards subjected Stockdale to even more brutal rope sessions, determined to break his resistance through pure physical agony. The rope trick's effectiveness lay in its simplicity. Guards needed no special equipment or training, just rope, pulleys, and the willingness to destroy human joints. The technique could be applied in any room at any time, making it the perfect portable torture device for a prison system designed around psychological warfare. Prisoners developed their own terminology for different rope configurations. The pretzel involved tying arms and legs together behind the back. The bow forced prisoners into backward arches that compressed their spines. The chicken wing dislocated one shoulder while keeping the other arm functional. A particularly cruel variant that left prisoners partially disabled. Some prisoners tried to prepare their bodies for rope sessions through exercises and stretching, but nothing could condition human joints for the unnatural positions the torture demanded. The rope trick exploited fundamental limitations of human anatomy, making resistance through physical conditioning impossible. The screams echoing through Hoa Lo prison's corridors became a soundtrack of suffering that haunted every prisoner. Men who weren't currently being tortured could hear their fellow Americans crying out in agony. The sounds created a constant reminder that the rope trick awaited anyone who stepped out of line. Vietnamese interrogators combined the rope trick with other psychological pressures to maximize its effectiveness. They would show prisoners photographs of their families while applying rope torture, suggesting that cooperation could reunite them with their loved ones. The combination of physical agony and emotional manipulation proved devastatingly effective. Guards sometimes left prisoners tied in rope positions for hours, allowing the torture to continue even when no one was actively pulling the ropes. Gravity became an accomplice in the torture, slowly increasing pressure on damaged joints as prisoners' own body weight worked against them. The rope trick's aftermath was almost as terrible as the torture itself. Prisoners returned to their cells with dislocated shoulders and damaged nerve systems. They couldn't lift their arms, feed themselves, or perform basic hygiene tasks. Fellow prisoners had to care for rope trick victims like infants, adding humiliation to their physical suffering. Medical treatment for rope trick injuries was non-existent. Vietnamese prison doctors ignored obvious signs of joint damage and nerve destruction. Prisoners' shoulders healed incorrectly, leaving them permanently disfigured and disabled. The torture's effects would follow survivors for the rest of their lives. The rope trick represented everything evil about the Vietnamese prison system. It was calculated, systematic, and designed to break human beings without killing them. For American prisoners of war, those simple lengths of rope became symbols of a nightmare that would haunt them long after their release. The concrete box measured 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet high. There was no window, no light, no human contact. Commander Jeremiah Denton was shoved into this tomb and heard the metal door slam shut behind him. The sound echoed in the darkness like a gunshot, then silence swallowed everything. This was solitary confinement, Vietnamese style, designed not just to isolate prisoners, but to systematically destroy their sanity. The isolation chambers at Hoa Lo prison were concrete coffins for the living, spaces so small that grown men couldn't fully extend their bodies in any direction. Denton tried to stand up straight and immediately hit his head on the low ceiling. He attempted to lie down, and his feet pressed against one wall while his head touched the other. There was no comfortable position, no way to stretch cramped muscles, no relief from the crushing claustrophobia that pressed in from all sides. The darkness was absolute. Vietnamese guards had sealed every crack that might allow light to penetrate these concrete tombs. Prisoners couldn't see their own hands inches from their faces. The human eye, designed to process visual information, began playing tricks when deprived of any stimulus whatsoever. Within days, hallucinations began. Denton saw flashes of light that weren't there. Shapes moved in the darkness, sometimes threatening, sometimes comforting. His brain, desperate for visual input, began manufacturing images from memory and imagination. The line between reality and delusion blurred in the perpetual night of solitary confinement. Time became meaningless in the isolation chambers. Without natural light cycles or human interaction, prisoners lost all sense of whether it was day or night, Monday or Friday. Some men tried to track time by counting heartbeats or breaths, but exhaustion and despair made even these simple tasks impossible to maintain. McCain spent months in solitary confinement, and the experience nearly shattered his mind. He began talking to the walls, carrying on conversations with imaginary companions. The sound of his own voice became precious, proof that he still existed in a world that seemed determined to erase him completely. The walls became his only companions. McCain ran his hands over every inch of concrete, memorizing each crack and imperfection. He counted the same bricks over and over, losing count and starting again. The repetitive actions became a form of meditation, a way to keep his mind occupied when there was literally nothing else to do. Some prisoners tried to maintain their sanity by creating elaborate mental exercises. They would design houses room by room, remembering every detail of their construction. They recited poetry learned in school, solved mathematical problems, or replayed entire movies in their heads. These mental gymnastics became lifelines in the ocean of isolation. But the human mind wasn't designed for complete sensory deprivation. After weeks or months in the isolation chambers, some prisoners began to crack. They screamed until their voices gave out. They beat their fists against concrete walls until their knuckles bled. They rocked back and forth like mental patients, trying to self-soothe in an environment designed to provide no comfort. The silence was perhaps the worst torture of all. Humans are social creatures who depend on interaction and communication for psychological health. In the isolation chambers, the only sounds were a prisoner's own breathing, heartbeat, and the occasional scurrying of rats. The absence of human voices became a form of sensory torture that drove some men to the edge of madness. Vietnamese guards understood the psychological power of complete isolation. They would leave prisoners in these concrete boxes for months at a time, checking on them only to deliver meager food rations or drag them out for interrogation sessions. The isolation chambers were weapons of psychological warfare more effective than any physical torture. Prisoners developed their own coping mechanisms to survive the mental assault of solitary confinement. Some created detailed fantasy worlds where they could escape mentally even while their bodies remained trapped. Others focused on memories of family and home, replaying happy moments over and over to maintain their connection to humanity. The physical effects of prolonged isolation were as devastating as the psychological damage. Prisoners' muscles atrophied from lack of movement in the cramped spaces. Their skin became pale and sickly from absence of sunlight. Some developed a condition called solitary syndrome, a combination of anxiety, depression, and cognitive impairment that could last for years after release. Guards sometimes used brief respites from isolation as psychological weapons. A prisoner might be moved to a slightly larger cell or allowed a few minutes of human contact, only to be thrown back into solitary confinement when guards decided he was becoming too comfortable. These brief tastes of normalcy made the return to isolation even more crushing. The isolation chambers revealed the fundamental cruelty of the Vietnamese prison system. These weren't designed to extract military intelligence or serve any practical purpose. They existed purely to break human spirits. The goal was to reduce proud American military officers to gibbering, broken shells of their former selves. Some prisoners never recovered from their time in solitary confinement. They emerged from the isolation chambers as hollow-eyed ghosts, unable to maintain eye contact or carry on normal conversations. The psychological damage was so severe that fellow prisoners had to care for them like children, feeding them and helping them perform basic tasks. The isolation chambers at Ho Lo prison represented the ultimate expression of psychological warfare. In those concrete boxes, Vietnamese captors didn't just imprison American bodies, they systematically destroyed American minds. The darkness, silence, and crushing loneliness became weapons more powerful than any physical torture device ever invented. The bright lights blazed down on McCain's face like miniature suns, burning his retinas and making sleep impossible. He'd been standing for 36 hours straight, swaying on feet so swollen they'd split his prison-issued sandals. The Vietnamese interrogator sat comfortably in a chair, sipping tea while watching his American prisoner slowly collapse. This was the quiz. Vietnamese slang for interrogation sessions that had nothing to do with extracting military intelligence and everything to do with psychological destruction. The questions weren't about troop movements or battle plans. They were designed to break down mental defenses, one carefully crafted query at a time. "Tell us about your childhood," the interrogator would begin, his English perfect from years of studying American prisoners. "What was your father's profession? Did your mother love you?" The questions seemed innocent, almost therapeutic. But every answer became ammunition in a psychological war designed to find and exploit emotional vulnerabilities. Vietnamese interrogators had studied American psychology with scientific precision. They understood that breaking a man's mind required patience, repetition, and the systematic destruction of everything he believed about himself, his country, and his mission. Physical torture was crude and temporary. Mental torture could last forever. The bright lights were just one weapon in their arsenal. Prisoners were forced to stand under blazing bulbs for days at a time, their eyes burning and watering until they couldn't see properly. The constant illumination disrupted natural sleep cycles, creating a twilight world where day and night became meaningless concepts. Sleep deprivation was perhaps their most effective tool. Human beings can survive weeks without food, days without water, but only a few days without sleep before their minds begin to unravel. Vietnamese guards understood this biological reality and weaponized it with ruthless efficiency. Prisoners were awakened every hour throughout the night for questioning. Guards would bang on cell doors, drag men from their concrete beds, and force them to stand at attention while asking meaningless questions. "What is your name? What is your rank? What is your serial number?" The same questions, repeated endlessly, until exhausted prisoners could barely remember the answers. The interrogation rooms were carefully designed psychological torture chambers. Bare concrete walls reflected sound, creating echoes that made prisoners' own voices seem strange and distorted. The furniture was deliberately uncomfortable, hard stools that created back pain, tables positioned at awkward heights that forced prisoners into uncomfortable positions. Temperature became another weapon. Interrogation rooms were kept freezing cold or blazing hot, depending on the season and the interrogator's mood. Prisoners sat naked or nearly naked, shivering uncontrollably or sweating profusely while trying to concentrate on questions designed to confuse and disorient them. Vietnamese interrogators played recordings of American voices to mess with prisoners' heads. They had captured audio from previous interrogations, radio broadcasts, and propaganda recordings. Hearing familiar accents and speech patterns in this hellish environment created cognitive dissonance that made reality harder to grasp. "Your government has abandoned you," the voices would whisper through hidden speakers. "Your family thinks you're dead. No one is coming to save you." The messages were delivered in perfect American English by prisoners who had already broken under psychological pressure, making the words even more devastating. The interrogators were masters of psychological manipulation. They would show prisoners old letters from home, then claim the letters proved their families had moved on and forgotten them. They displayed photographs of American casualties, suggesting the war was lost and continued resistance was pointless. Quiz sessions could last for days without interruption. Prisoners were forced to remain standing while interrogators worked in shifts, staying fresh while their victims grew increasingly exhausted and disoriented. The unequal nature of these encounters was deliberate, designed to make prisoners feel powerless and overwhelmed. Questions were repeated thousands of times with slight variations. "Why did you bomb innocent Vietnamese civilians?" became, "Why did you murder Vietnamese children?" The subtle changes were designed to make prisoners accept increasingly damaging characterizations of their actions and motivations. Vietnamese interrogators used prisoners' own words against them. They recorded everything and played back statements out of context to create contradictions and confusion. A prisoner who mentioned missing his family might later hear his own voice saying he hated being away from home, twisted to suggest he regretted serving his country. The constant threat of execution hung over every interrogation session. Guards would cock pistols behind prisoners' heads, making them believe death was seconds away. They described elaborate execution methods and showed prisoners to empty graves supposedly dug for them. The fear of imminent death made concentration impossible. Some prisoners were forced to write their own obituaries and letters home, explaining their crimes against the Vietnamese people. The psychological impact of composing their own death notices while still alive created a form of mental torture that left lasting scars on survivors' psyches. Interrogators exploited every piece of personal information they could gather. They would mention prisoners' children by name, describe their wives' daily routines, or reference family problems they had learned through intercepted mail. This intimate knowledge made prisoners feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that physical torture never could. The quiz sessions revealed the true purpose of the Vietnamese prison system. It wasn't about gathering military intelligence. Most prisoners had been out of combat for months or years and possessed no current operational knowledge. The goal was psychological destruction, the systematic dismantling of American military officers' mental defenses. Guards would sometimes offer relief from the interrogation sessions in exchange for small concessions. A prisoner who agreed to write a brief statement criticizing American policy might earn a few hours of sleep or a slightly better meal. These small compromises created guilt and shame that made future resistance even more difficult. The interrogation games never truly ended. Even when prisoners were returned to their cells, they knew another quiz session was always coming. The anticipation became its own form of torture, a constant anxiety that prevented rest or peace of mind. Vietnamese interrogators had turned psychological warfare into a science, using sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and emotional exploitation to break down human minds with surgical precision. The quiz sessions were laboratories where they perfected techniques for destroying the human spirit. The infection had been spreading through McCain's broken arm for 3 months. Green pus oozed from wounds that should have healed weeks earlier. His fever spiked so high that he drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently to guards who watched him deteriorate with calculated indifference. Vietnamese prison doctors weren't healers. They were accomplices in a systematic campaign of medical torture. Their job wasn't to cure prisoners, but to keep them alive just long enough to extract maximum psychological value from their suffering. Death was acceptable, but only after every ounce of propaganda potential had been squeezed from their broken bodies. McCain's shoulder had been shattered during his ejection and worsened by repeated torture sessions. The joint had healed incorrectly, leaving his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Vietnamese medics could have reset the bones properly, but they chose to let the injury fester and deform. The visible disability served their purposes better than proper medical treatment. Stockdale's back injury from his parachute malfunction never received adequate care. The vertebrae had compressed during his hard landing, creating chronic pain that made sitting or standing agony. Prison doctors examined the injury and prescribed nothing more than aspirin. When they bothered to provide any medication at all, broken bones were left to heal however nature intended. Prisoners with fractured ribs, shattered legs, and crushed hands received no splints, casts, or surgical intervention. Their bodies became living museums of untreated trauma, each deformity a testament to Vietnamese medical cruelty. Denton's shoulder injury from his ejection created a permanent disability that Vietnamese doctors deliberately ignored. The joint never regained full mobility, leaving his arm partially paralyzed. Simple tasks like feeding himself or scratching his nose became monumental challenges that reminded him daily of his captors' calculated neglect. Tropical diseases ran rampant through the prison population. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery infected prisoners repeatedly, weakening their immune systems and creating cascading health crises. Vietnamese medical staff possessed the knowledge and medications to treat these conditions, but chose to let Americans suffer through potentially fatal illnesses. Dysentery turned prisoners' digestive systems into sources of constant agony. Men lost control of their bowels, soiling themselves repeatedly while guards mocked their humiliation. The dehydration and electrolyte imbalance caused by chronic diarrhea left prisoners weak and disoriented, making them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. Open wounds became breeding grounds for infection in the tropical climate. Simple cuts from shackles or beatings festered into gangrenous sores that ate away at surrounding tissue. Prisoners watched helplessly as minor injuries transformed into life-threatening conditions that could have been prevented with basic antiseptic care. Fellow prisoners became the primary source of medical treatment in this nightmare system. Men with no medical training learned to set broken bones, drain infected wounds, and care for delirious fever victims. They shared their meager food rations with sick cellmates and took turns nursing fellow Americans back from the brink of death. McCain's cellmate became his lifeline during his worst medical crises. The man helped him eat when his arms wouldn't function, cleaned his infected wounds with strips torn from prison clothing, and stayed awake through the night to monitor his breathing during high fevers. This prisoner-to-prisoner care system was the only thing standing between many Americans and death. Vitamin deficiencies created additional medical horrors that Vietnamese doctors could have easily prevented. Scurvy caused prisoners' teeth to fall out and their gums to bleed constantly. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency left men stumbling through their cells in complete darkness. Beriberi attacked their nervous systems, causing numbness and heart problems. The psychological impact of watching fellow prisoners die from treatable conditions was devastating. Americans who had served together in combat were forced to watch their friends waste away from infections that could have been cured with antibiotics. The helplessness of being unable to save dying comrades created guilt and trauma that lasted long after release. Vietnamese prison doctors occasionally provided minimal treatment, but only when it served their propaganda purposes. A prisoner who might be useful for filmed confessions would receive just enough medical care to make him presentable on camera. Once the propaganda value was extracted, medical neglect resumed with renewed cruelty. Some prisoners tried to treat themselves using improvised methods. They fashioned splints from pieces of wood or metal found in their cells. They created antiseptic solutions from soap and water. They performed crude surgery on each other using sharpened spoons or pieces of broken glass. These desperate measures sometimes worked, but often made injuries worse. The medical neglect wasn't accidental or the result of limited resources. Vietnamese prison authorities had access to modern medications and surgical equipment. They chose to withhold medical treatment as another weapon in their psychological warfare arsenal. Watching Americans suffer and die from treatable conditions was part of their systematic dehumanization campaign. Prison medical records, when they existed at all, documented the deliberate nature of this neglect. Vietnamese doctors noted prisoners' conditions but recommended no treatment. They observed infections spreading and bones healing incorrectly without intervening. The medical neglect was as calculated and intentional as any other aspect of the torture program. The long-term consequences of this medical neglect followed survivors for decades after their release. Improperly healed bones created permanent disabilities. Untreated infections caused organ damage. Nutritional deficiencies weakened immune systems that never fully recovered. The Vietnamese had created walking casualties whose bodies bore witness to years of systematic medical cruelty. In the suffocating darkness of his isolation cell, Commander James Stockdale heard something that changed everything: a faint tapping sound coming through the concrete wall. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was deliberate, purposeful. Someone was trying to communicate. This wasn't random noise from construction or guards moving equipment. This was Morse code, adapted for prison walls. An American prisoner in the adjacent cell was reaching out through solid concrete using the only communication method their captors couldn't completely eliminate: sound transmitted through stone and steel. The tap code became the lifeline that connected isolated Americans throughout the Vietnamese prison system. It was a simple but brilliant adaptation of Morse code, designed specifically for prisoners who couldn't see each other but could make noise against shared walls, pipes, and floors. The system used a 5x5 grid containing the alphabet minus the letter K, which was replaced by C. Each letter was represented by two numbers, its row and column position in the grid. The letter A was row 1, column 1, transmitted as 1 tap, pause, 1 tap. The letter B was 1 tap, pause, 2 taps. Complex messages could be spelled out letter by letter through this patient tapping process. Learning the tap code required incredible mental discipline. Prisoners had to memorize the entire grid system while maintaining absolute secrecy about their communication network. Getting caught using the tap code meant severe punishment, beatings, extended isolation, or worse, torture sessions designed to break their will to communicate. But the psychological benefits outweighed the risks. For men who had been isolated for months, hearing another American voice through the walls was like discovering they weren't alone in hell. The tap code proved that their fellow prisoners were still alive, still fighting, still maintaining their humanity despite Vietnamese efforts to destroy it. Stockdale became one of the tap code's primary organizers within the prison system. As the senior ranking officer among many prisoner groups, he used the communication network to maintain military discipline and command structure even while locked in separate cells. Orders, encouragement, and vital information flowed through the concrete walls via carefully tapped messages. The code allowed prisoners to share crucial intelligence about guard rotations, interrogation techniques, and prison policies. When one American discovered that cooperation with certain demands led to better treatment, he could warn others through the tap code network. When guards planned surprise cell searches or torture sessions, advance warning traveled through the walls at the speed of sound. Medical information became another vital use for the tap code system. Prisoners with medical knowledge could diagnose and treat fellow Americans by receiving detailed symptom descriptions through tapped messages. Treatment, recommendations, medication information, and psychological support flowed through the prison via this underground communication network. The tap code also served as a morale booster during the darkest periods of captivity. Prisoners shared jokes, memories of home, and messages of encouragement through the walls. Birthday greetings, holiday wishes, and simple expressions of friendship helped maintain the human connections that Vietnamese isolation policies were designed to destroy. Guards eventually discovered the tap code system and implemented harsh punishments for anyone caught communicating. Prisoners found tapping faced extended periods in isolation, reduced food rations, and intensified torture sessions. But the communication network was too valuable to abandon. Americans simply became more careful about when and how they used it. Prisoners developed sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection while maintaining their communication lifeline. They tapped during mealtimes when guards were distracted, used soft materials to muffle the sound, and created relay systems that could pass messages through multiple cells without direct wall contact between the original sender and final recipient. The tap code evolved into more than just a communication system. It became a form of resistance against Vietnamese psychological warfare. Every tapped message was an act of defiance, proof that American prisoners refused to be completely isolated and dehumanized. The code maintained military discipline and unity in conditions designed to break both. Some prisoners became experts at the tap code, capable of transmitting and receiving complex messages at remarkable speed. They served as communication hubs, relaying information throughout their sections of the prison and maintaining contact between isolated groups of Americans. These tap code specialists risked severe punishment, but considered their communication duties essential to group survival. The psychological impact of losing tap code contact was devastating. When prisoners were moved to new cells or placed in areas where wall communication was impossible, the sudden silence felt like death. Men who had grown accustomed to daily contact with fellow Americans through the walls experienced crushing loneliness when that lifeline was severed. Vietnamese guards tried various methods to eliminate tap code communication. They moved prisoners frequently, placed them in cells with thicker walls, and increased punishments for anyone caught tapping. But the system was too simple and too valuable to completely suppress. As long as Americans were imprisoned together, some form of tap code communication continued. The code also allowed prisoners to maintain accurate records of their captivity. They shared dates, tracked time, and compiled lists of fellow prisoners and their conditions. This information proved invaluable after their release, helping military investigators understand the full scope of Vietnamese prison operations and prisoner treatment. Through concrete walls and steel barriers, the tap code carried hope, information, and human connection to men who had been stripped of everything else. It was proof that the human spirit could find ways to communicate and survive even in the most carefully designed systems of isolation and psychological torture. The camera lights blazed hot against Commander Jeremiah Denton's bruised face as Vietnamese filmmakers prepared to record his confession. He'd been tortured for weeks leading up to this moment, his body broken by rope tricks and his mind clouded by sleep deprivation. But as the camera rolled, Denton did something his captors never expected. He began blinking in Morse code. PELINK-TORTURE. His eyelids moved in deliberate patterns, spelling out the truth about his treatment, while his voice spoke the lies his captors had forced him to memorize. American intelligence officers watching the propaganda film later would decode his message and understand the reality behind Vietnamese claims of humane treatment. This moment represented the ultimate battle in Vietnam's psychological warfare campaign, the fight for narrative control. Vietnamese captors understood that broken American prisoners could be worth more than military intelligence. They could be transformed into propaganda weapons that would demoralize the American public and legitimize North Vietnam's cause on the world stage. The propaganda campaign began immediately after capture. Vietnamese photographers documented every stage of the prisoner experience, but only the images that served their narrative purposes. Pictures of well-treated Americans eating meals were staged carefully, hiding the fact that the food shown was far better than prisoners' normal starvation rations. Prisoners were forced to pose for photographs that would later appear in international newspapers and magazines. They were cleaned up, given fresh clothes, and positioned in settings designed to suggest comfortable living conditions. These images contradicted the reality of their daily existence in concrete cells filled with rats, roaches, and human waste. The letter-writing campaigns represented another front in the propaganda war. Vietnamese censors intercepted all prisoner correspondence and rewrote letters home to serve their political agenda. Families in America received messages supposedly from their captured loved ones, expressing regret about the war and criticizing American foreign policy. McCain's mother received letters that appeared to be written in her son's handwriting, but contained political statements he would never have made voluntarily. The psychological warfare extended beyond the prison walls, targeting American families and public opinion through manipulated correspondence that bore prisoners' authentic signatures, but contained Vietnamese propaganda messages. Forced confessions became the crown jewels of the Vietnamese propaganda machine. Prisoners were tortured until they agreed to read prepared statements admitting to war crimes, expressing regret for their military service, and denouncing American involvement in Vietnam. These confessions were broadcast on radio, published in newspapers, and distributed to international media outlets. The confession process was carefully orchestrated psychological theater. Prisoners were cleaned up, dressed in fresh clothes, and positioned in comfortable-looking settings before cameras rolled. The contrast between their apparent well-being on film and their actual condition in prison was stark and deliberate, designed to support Vietnamese claims of humane treatment. Vietnamese interrogators spent months crafting confession scripts that would have maximum propaganda impact. They studied each prisoner's background, family situation, and psychological vulnerabilities to create personalized statements that seemed authentic. The confessions contained just enough personal details to convince viewers they were genuine expressions of remorse. Some prisoners found ways to sabotage the propaganda efforts despite the enormous risks involved. They would mispronounce words, use unusual inflections, or include subtle signals that indicated they were speaking under duress. These small acts of resistance required incredible courage, as getting caught meant severe punishment and extended torture sessions. The Vietnamese also used prisoner letters and statements to create internal propaganda for their own population. They published excerpts in Vietnamese newspapers showing their citizens that even American military officers recognized the justice of their cause. This domestic propaganda helped maintain popular support for the war effort and justified the enormous costs of the conflict. Audio recordings of prisoner statements were broadcast on Vietnamese radio and transmitted to American forces in the field. Hearing their captured comrades apparently criticizing the war effort was designed to demoralize American troops and create doubt about their mission. The psychological impact of these broadcasts extended far beyond the prison walls. Vietnamese filmmakers created elaborate documentary productions featuring American prisoners. These films showed prisoners playing volleyball, reading books, and engaging in educational activities. The footage was carefully edited to hide the torture, starvation, and medical neglect that defined prisoners' actual experiences. The propaganda campaigns required extensive preparation and rehearsal. Prisoners were forced to practice their statements repeatedly until they could deliver them convincingly on camera. Those who stumbled over words or showed obvious signs of distress were subjected to additional torture until their performances met Vietnamese standards. International journalists and peace activists were occasionally allowed to visit selected prisoners under carefully controlled conditions. These visits were staged propaganda events where prisoners were coached to express gratitude for their treatment and criticism of American war policies. The visitors often left believing they had witnessed evidence of humane prisoner treatment. Vietnamese propagandists understood the power of visual imagery in shaping public opinion. They photographed prisoners receiving medical care, eating meals, and participating in recreational activities. These images were distributed worldwide to counter reports of prisoner abuse and torture, creating a false narrative of benevolent captivity. The psychological pressure to participate in propaganda activities was immense. Prisoners who refused to cooperate faced extended isolation, increased torture, and threats against their families. Some men broke under this pressure and provided statements they would regret for the rest of their lives, carrying guilt and shame long after their release. The propaganda warfare revealed the true scope of Vietnamese ambitions in their treatment of American prisoners. These men weren't just military captives. They were weapons in a global information war designed to turn American public opinion against the conflict and legitimize North Vietnamese political objectives through the voices of their enemies. The bowl of rice arrived with actual meat in it, not the usual rotting fish scraps, but recognizable pieces of chicken that hadn't turned green with decay. McCain stared at the meal in disbelief. After months of watery pumpkin soup and maggot-infested rice, This looked like a feast fit for kings. The guard who delivered it smiled, an expression McCain hadn't seen on a Vietnamese face since his capture. "You have been cooperative," the man said in broken English. "Perhaps conditions can improve for those who understand their situation." This was the soft treatment trap, one of the most insidious weapons in the Vietnamese psychological warfare arsenal. After months or years of systematic torture, starvation, and abuse, prisoners would suddenly receive dramatically improved treatment. Better food, medical attention, clean clothes, and even small luxuries like soap or reading material would appear as if by magic. The improvement wasn't random or the result of policy changes. It was a calculated manipulation designed to create psychological dependency and break down resistance more effectively than torture ever could. Prisoners who had endured months of brutality were particularly vulnerable to this sudden kindness, their minds desperate to believe their suffering might finally be ending. McCain received his first taste of soft treatment after a particularly brutal series of torture sessions had left him barely conscious. Vietnamese guards moved him to a cleaner cell, provided him with medical attention for his infected wounds, and began feeding him meals that actually contained nutritional value. The relief was overwhelming after so much suffering. But the improved treatment came with strings attached. Guards would hint that continued cooperation could lead to even better conditions, perhaps even early release. They showed McCain propaganda materials suggesting that other prisoners who had seen the light were being treated humanely and might soon return to their families. The psychological impact was devastating. After months of believing his captors were monsters capable only of cruelty, McCain found himself feeling grateful to the same people who had tortured him. This Stockholm Syndrome-like response was exactly what Vietnamese interrogators had calculated would happen. Vietnamese captors were masters at timing these soft treatment periods for maximum psychological impact. They would wait until prisoners had reached their breaking points, when resistance was at its lowest and desperation at its highest. Then, like salvation appearing in hell, improved conditions would materialize seemingly out of nowhere. The soft treatment trap worked because it exploited fundamental human psychology. Prisoners who had been systematically dehumanized for months were psychologically primed to feel overwhelming gratitude for basic human dignity. A clean cell felt like luxury. Edible food felt like generosity. Medical attention felt like compassion. Guards would engage prisoners in friendly conversations during soft treatment periods, asking about their families and expressing sympathy for their situation. These interactions created emotional connections that made it harder for prisoners to maintain their resistance. The enemy began to seem human, even caring. But the kindness was always conditional and temporary. Prisoners who accepted the improved treatment while maintaining their resistance would eventually see conditions return to their previous brutality. The message was clear. Cooperation brought comfort, while defiance brought suffering. Some prisoners received soft treatment specifically to make them useful for propaganda purposes. They would be cleaned up, fed nutritious meals, and given medical attention to make them look healthy and well-treated for photographs or filmed statements. Once their propaganda value was extracted, the harsh conditions resumed immediately. The psychological whiplash of losing soft treatment was often more devastating than the original torture had been. Prisoners who had begun to hope their suffering was ending would find themselves thrown back into isolation cells, returned to starvation rations, and subjected to renewed torture sessions. The crushing disappointment broke spirits that had survived months of systematic abuse. Vietnamese guards deliberately created competition among prisoners for soft treatment privileges. They would provide improved conditions to some Americans while maintaining brutal treatment for others in the same cell block. This favoritism created jealousy, resentment, and suspicion among men who needed to support each other to survive. The soft treatment trap revealed the sophisticated understanding Vietnamese captors had developed about human psychology. They knew that alternating between extreme cruelty and unexpected kindness could break down mental defenses more effectively than consistent brutality. The unpredictability kept prisoners off balance and emotionally vulnerable. Prisoners learned to distrust any improvement in their conditions, understanding that Vietnamese kindness was always a manipulation tactic. But this knowledge didn't make the psychological impact less powerful. Starving, tortured men couldn't help but feel grateful when their suffering was temporarily reduced, even when they knew it was calculated manipulation. The soft treatment trap demonstrated that psychological warfare could be more devastating than physical torture. By manipulating hope, gratitude, and basic human needs, Vietnamese captors could break down resistance and create compliance without leaving the obvious scars that torture produced. It was cruelty disguised as mercy. The monsoon rains began in May, transforming McCain's concrete cell from a prison into a drowning chamber. Water cascaded through cracks in the ceiling, pooling on the floor, until prisoners were forced to stand in ankle-deep sewage mixed with rainwater. The tropical downpour turned every cell in Hoa Lo prison into a fetid swamp where human waste, rotting food, and disease bred in the stagnant water. Vietnamese guards made no effort to drain the flooded cells. They watched with calculated indifference as American prisoners stood for hours in contaminated water that reached their knees during the worst storms. The flooding wasn't an unfortunate side effect of poor prison maintenance. It was another weapon in their psychological warfare arsenal. Stockdale's cell flooded so completely during one monsoon that he couldn't sit down for 3 days straight. His legs swelled grotesquely from standing in the contaminated water, and open wounds on his ankles became infected from the sewage that surrounded him. The combination of exhaustion and infection nearly killed him, which was exactly the level of suffering his captors intended to maintain. The humidity during monsoon season made breathing feel like drowning on dry land. The air became so thick with moisture that prisoners' lungs struggled to extract oxygen from the soupy atmosphere. Every breath required conscious effort, turning the basic act of respiration into another form of torture that lasted for months. Clothing never dried during the wet season. Prisoners wore the same damp, rotting garments for weeks at a time, their skin developing fungal infections and sores from the constant moisture. The fabric would literally rot off their bodies, leaving them with rags that provided no protection from insects or the elements. Sleep became impossible during monsoon floods. Prisoners couldn't lie down without submerging themselves in sewage water, so they learned to sleep standing, up or crouched in corners where the water was slightly shallower. The sleep deprivation compounded their physical suffering and made them more vulnerable to psychological manipulation during interrogations. When the monsoons ended, different weather-related tortures began. The tropical sun turned concrete cells into ovens that reached temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. With no ventilation and minimal water rations, prisoners experienced heat stroke symptoms that left them delirious and hallucinating. Denton's cell faced west, catching the full force of the afternoon sun through a small window that acted like a magnifying glass. The concrete walls absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, creating a furnace effect that made sleep impossible. His skin blistered from contact with the superheated concrete floor. Vietnamese guards deliberately restricted water during the hottest months, providing barely enough to prevent death from dehydration. Prisoners' tongues swelled, their lips cracked and bled, and their urine turned dark amber from severe dehydration. The psychological torture of extreme thirst was as devastating as any physical abuse. Winter brought different but equally calculated suffering. Northern Vietnam's temperatures could drop into the 40s, and prisoners had no blankets, warm clothing, or heating in their concrete cells. The cold seeped through the stone walls and floors, chilling prisoners to the bone and causing uncontrollable shivering that lasted for months. McCain's broken arms, damaged by torture and never properly healed, became sources of excruciating pain during cold weather. The damaged joints and nerve endings created a form of weather-related torture that reminded him daily of his captor's cruelty. Every temperature drop brought fresh waves of agony through his permanently injured limbs. The concrete cells acted like refrigerators during winter, holding the cold and amplifying its effects on human bodies. Prisoners huddled against walls trying to find warmth, but the stone surfaces were always colder than the air temperature. Hypothermia became a constant threat that weakened immune systems already compromised by malnutrition and disease. Humidity remained high even during cooler months, creating perfect conditions for respiratory infections and pneumonia. The combination of cold temperatures and moisture-saturated air created an environment where diseases flourished and spread rapidly through the prison population. Vietnamese medical staff ignored these predictable health crises. Weather became another enemy in prisoners' daily struggle for survival. They learned to dread the changing seasons, knowing each transition brought new forms of suffering. The monsoons meant flooding and disease. Summer meant heat stroke and dehydration. Winter meant hypothermia and respiratory illness. Vietnamese captors understood that weather could be weaponized as effectively as any torture device. By denying prisoners adequate shelter, clothing, and climate control, they turned the natural environment into an accomplice in their systematic campaign of physical and psychological destruction. Nature itself became another tool for breaking American spirits. The metal doors exploded open at 3 a.m. with a crash that shattered the prison's uneasy silence. Vietnamese guards flooded into the cell block like a human tsunami, screaming orders and wielding clubs with practiced brutality. McCain jerked awake from his concrete bed as boots thundered past his cell door. This wasn't a scheduled inspection or interrogation. This was a purge raid designed to terrorize prisoners into absolute submission through random, overwhelming violence. The raids had no schedule, no predictable pattern that prisoners could prepare for. Vietnamese guards understood that unpredictability was a weapon more powerful than any torture device. Men who never knew when violence would explode around them lived in constant fear, their nervous systems permanently damaged by the anticipation of brutality that could arrive at any moment. Guards dragged Stockdale from his cell without explanation, his bare feet scraping against the concrete floor as they hauled him toward the interrogation rooms. He hadn't violated any prison rules or shown signs of resistance. His only crime was being American, which made him a target in these campaigns of systematic terror designed to break spirits through sheer, overwhelming force. The purge raids served multiple psychological purposes beyond simple intimidation. They reminded prisoners that Vietnamese guards held absolute power over their lives, that safety was an illusion, and that survival depended entirely on their captors' whims. Sleep became impossible when any moment could bring the crash of doors and the thunder of boots in the corridors. Cell searches during purge raids were exercises in calculated destruction. Guards would tear apart prisoners' meager possessions with savage efficiency, destroying anything that might provide comfort or maintain connection to their former lives. A photograph hidden in a shoe sole, a makeshift calendar scratched into concrete, a small piece of string saved for emergency repairs. Everything disappeared into the guards' systematic campaign of psychological destruction. Denton watched helplessly as guards destroyed a crude chess set he had fashioned from bits of concrete and metal. He had spent months creating the pieces, carving them with his fingernails in a sharp stone. The chess set represented hours of mental escape from the horrors of captivity, and its destruction was as devastating as any physical beating he had endured. The raids targeted prisoners' most precious possessions, items that maintained their connection to humanity and hope. Guards would find letters from home that had somehow survived censorship and tear them to shreds in front of their owners. They destroyed improvised medical, supplies that prisoners had created to treat each other's wounds. They confiscated any materials that could be used for communication or record-keeping. Vietnamese guards understood that destroying these small treasures was more psychologically damaging than physical torture. A beating would heal eventually, but watching months of careful work destroyed in seconds created despair that lasted forever. The message was clear. You are allowed to own nothing, hope for nothing, and expect nothing but suffering. Some prisoners simply disappeared during purge raids, dragged from their cells, and never seen again. Their cellmates would wake to find empty spaces where friends had slept the night before, with no explanation of where they had gone or whether they were still alive. The disappearances created an atmosphere of terror that made every raid feel potentially fatal. The psychological impact of watching fellow Americans vanish without trace was devastating. Survivors were left wondering if their friends were dead, transferred to worse prisons, or subjected to torture so severe that death would be merciful. The uncertainty was another weapon in the Vietnamese arsenal of mental warfare. Guards would sometimes return missing prisoners days or weeks later, but they came back changed. Some bore obvious signs of torture, fresh wounds, broken bones, or psychological damage that left them unable to communicate coherently. Others seemed physically unharmed, but had been broken mentally, their eyes empty and their spirits crushed. The raids created a climate of mutual suspicion among prisoners. Guards would hint that certain Americans were being targeted because fellow prisoners had reported their activities. This psychological manipulation made men distrust each other, destroying the solidarity that was essential for survival in the brutal prison environment. Mass punishment became another feature of purge raids. If guards discovered any evidence of resistance or communication among prisoners, entire cell blocks would face collective retribution. Innocent men would be beaten, starved, or subjected to extended isolation because of actions taken by others. This policy made prisoners police each other's behavior out of fear. The violence during purge raids was random and excessive, designed to create maximum psychological impact, rather than serve any practical purpose. Guards would beat prisoners who offered no resistance, destroy cells that were already empty of contraband, and terrorize men who had shown complete compliance with prison rules. Vietnamese commanders understood that these terror campaigns were more effective than consistent brutality. Prisoners could adapt to predictable violence, but random raids kept them in a constant state of hypervigilance that prevented psychological adjustment to their captivity. The unpredictable nature of the raids made every quiet moment feel temporary and dangerous. The purge raids revealed the true nature of the Vietnamese prison system. It wasn't designed to extract information or serve any military purpose. It was a machine for psychological destruction, calibrated to break human spirits through calculated applications of terror, uncertainty, and overwhelming force that could strike without warning at any moment. The concrete walls of McCain's cell had become his architect's office. Every morning, he would begin construction on a new house, not with hammer and nails, but with his mind. He'd start with the foundation, visualizing every detail of the concrete pour, the rebar placement, the exact measurements needed for structural integrity. Then came the framing, room by room, nail by nail, until he had constructed entire buildings in his imagination. This wasn't idle daydreaming. This was psychological warfare against his captors, fought on the battlefield of his own mind. McCain understood that Vietnamese guards could control his body, but his thoughts remained his own territory. Every mental construction project was an act of resistance, a refusal to let his mind surrender to the crushing environment of Ho Lo prison. The house-building exercises served multiple purposes beyond simple distraction. They required intense concentration and technical knowledge, forcing his brain to work at levels that prevented the mental deterioration his captors hoped to achieve. McCain would spend hours calculating load-bearing requirements, designing electrical systems, and planning landscaping for homes that existed only in his imagination. Each mental construction project became more elaborate than the last. McCain built ranch houses, colonial mansions, and modern architectural marvels. He designed custom kitchens with specific appliances, planned bathrooms with particular tile patterns, and created libraries with detailed book collections. The precision required to maintain these complex mental images kept his mind sharp, despite months of torture and starvation. Commander James Stockdale took a different approach to mental survival, drawing on his philosophical education to create an intellectual fortress against Vietnamese psychological warfare. He had studied Stoic philosophy as a young officer, and now those ancient teachings became his lifeline in the concrete hell of solitary confinement. Stockdale would recite passages from Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, using their wisdom about enduring hardship to maintain his sanity. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength, became his daily mantra. The Stoic emphasis on controlling one's response to circumstances rather than the circumstances themselves provided a framework for psychological survival. The philosophical exercises weren't just intellectual comfort. They were practical tools for maintaining mental discipline. Stockdale would engage in complex logical arguments with himself, debating ethical questions and moral principles. These mental gymnastics kept his analytical abilities functioning at high levels despite the systematic attempts to break down his cognitive processes. Other prisoners developed their own unique mental survival strategies. Some created elaborate fantasy worlds where they could escape psychologically even while their bodies remained trapped in concrete cells. They would imagine detailed adventures, romantic relationships, and heroic quests that transported them far from the reality of their captivity. Mathematical problems became another form of mental resistance. Prisoners would challenge themselves with complex calculations, working through engineering problems or statistical analyses without paper or pencil. The mental effort required to perform these calculations kept their minds active and prevented the intellectual deterioration that prolonged isolation typically caused. Memory exercises served dual purposes, maintaining cognitive function while preserving connections to their former lives. Prisoners would mentally replay entire conversations with family members, reconstructing dialogue word for word. They would remember complete movies scene by scene, or recite poetry and literature they had learned years earlier. McCain would have detailed imaginary conversations with his wife and children, discussing their daily activities and sharing his experiences in ways he could never do in censored prison letters. These mental dialogues maintained emotional connections that Vietnamese isolation policies were designed to destroy. His family remained real and present in his mind, even when they were thousands of miles away. The creation of internal worlds became a form of psychological architecture. Prisoners would design elaborate mental landscapes, cities, forests, beaches, that they could visit whenever the concrete reality became unbearable. These imaginary places had detailed geography, weather patterns, and inhabitants that made them feel as real as the prison cells that confined their bodies. Some prisoners focused on planning their futures in minute detail. They would design post-war careers, plan family vacations, and set specific goals for their return to civilian life. These future-oriented mental exercises provided hope and purpose that helped them survive the seemingly endless present of their captivity. Religious faith became another powerful tool for mental survival. Prisoners would recite prayers, recall biblical passages, and engage in complex theological discussions with themselves. The spiritual dimension of their resistance provided comfort and meaning that transcended their physical circumstances. Vietnamese guards occasionally discovered evidence of these mental activities when prisoners accidentally spoke aloud during their internal exercises. The punishments for maintaining active mental lives were severe: extended isolation, reduced food rations, and intensified torture sessions designed to break down the psychological defenses prisoners had constructed. But the mental survival strategies proved remarkably resilient. Even under extreme duress, prisoners found ways to maintain their intellectual and emotional lives. They would simplify their mental exercises when torture made complex thinking impossible, then gradually rebuild their internal worlds as their conditions improved. The success of these psychological survival techniques revealed something profound about human nature. Even in conditions designed to destroy the human spirit, the mind could create spaces of freedom that no amount of physical control could eliminate. Vietnamese captors could imprison bodies, but they could never completely capture the territories of imagination, memory, and hope that prisoners constructed within their own minds. These mental survival strategies became the foundation for long-term psychological resilience that would help survivors readjust to freedom after their release. The interrogator leaned forward across the metal table, his voice soft and reasonable. "Just tell us about your squadron's radio frequencies. Nothing classified, just basic communication procedures. This information will help us end the war sooner and save lives on both sides." McCain stared at the concrete floor, reciting the only response he was authorized to give. "John Sidney McCain, Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, service number 6.24787. The words had become his shield, his identity, his last connection to the military oath he had sworn years earlier. The code of conduct for American fighting forces was clear and unambiguous. When captured, military personnel were required to provide only 4 pieces of information: name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Everything else, unit assignments, weapon systems, tactical procedures, fellow servicemen's identities, was classified information that could cost American lives if revealed to the enemy. Vietnamese interrogators understood the code's power and made breaking it their primary objective. They weren't particularly interested in military intelligence that was months or years out of date. Their real goal was psychological, forcing proud American officers to violate their sacred oath and betray everything they had sworn to protect. The pressure to break the code was relentless and multifaceted. Guards would withhold medical treatment from prisoners with infected wounds, promising antibiotics in exchange for minor intelligence about aircraft specifications. They would show prisoners photographs of their families, suggesting that cooperation could lead to letters home or even early release. Stockdale faced particularly intense pressure because of his senior rank and extensive knowledge of naval operations. Vietnamese interrogators spent months trying to extract information about carrier operations, flight procedures, and command structures. They alternated between torture sessions and reasonable discussions, always returning to the same demand for classified information. The psychological weight of maintaining the code under extreme duress was enormous. Prisoners knew that breaking under torture was understandable and forgivable, but the guilt of potentially causing fellow Americans deaths through revealed intelligence created internal pressure that was almost unbearable. The code wasn't just military regulation, it was a moral obligation to protect their brothers in arms. Some prisoners found creative ways to comply with the code while appearing to cooperate with their captors. They would provide information that was obviously false, outdated by years, or completely unclassified. Denton once spent hours describing aircraft maintenance procedures that were standard knowledge available in any technical manual, giving Vietnamese interrogators useless information while technically answering their questions. The code created internal conflicts that were as torturous as any physical abuse. Prisoners who had been tortured beyond human endurance faced impossible choices between their duty to resist and their biological drive to survive. The Vietnamese exploited these moral dilemmas with surgical precision, creating situations where any choice felt like betrayal. Guards would bring in other prisoners who had already broken and force them to encourage resistance holdouts to cooperate. Watching fellow Americans advocate for code violations was more psychologically devastating than any torture session. The sight of broken comrades urging surrender created doubt about whether continued resistance was heroic or simply stubborn pride. Vietnamese interrogators became experts at exploiting the code's psychological vulnerabilities. They would claim that other prisoners had already provided specific information, making continued resistance seem pointless. They would suggest that the war was nearly over, and that intelligence gathered now would be useless anyway, making code violations seem harmless. The code also created hierarchies of guilt and shame among prisoners. Those who had revealed classified information, even under extreme torture, carried psychological burdens that affected their relationships with fellow captives. Some prisoners who had maintained perfect code compliance looked down on those who had broken, creating additional psychological pressure in an environment where solidarity was essential for survival. Military training had prepared officers for the possibility of capture, but nothing could adequately prepare them for the systematic psychological warfare that Vietnamese captors employed. The code provided a framework for resistance, but it couldn't eliminate the human cost of maintaining that resistance under conditions designed to break the strongest minds. Some prisoners developed personal interpretations of the code that allowed them to maintain their sanity while preserving their honor. They would provide information that was technically accurate but practically useless, or reveal details that were so general they couldn't compromise ongoing operations. These mental gymnastics helped them feel they were complying with both the code and their captors' demands. The code's ultimate purpose wasn't just protecting military secrets, it was preserving the humanity and dignity of captured servicemen. By maintaining their oath even under impossible circumstances, prisoners retained their identity as American military officers rather than becoming broken tools of enemy propaganda. Vietnamese captors eventually learned that the code of conduct was more than just military regulation. It was a psychological anchor that helped prisoners maintain their sanity and resistance. Breaking the code became their primary objective, understanding that forcing violations would accomplish more psychological destruction than any torture technique they could devise. The screaming started at 2 a.m. and didn't stop until dawn. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Rissner had finally reached the edge of human endurance after 18 months in solitary confinement. His voice echoed through the concrete corridors of Hoa Lo prison like a wounded animal, raw and primal. The sound of a human mind collapsing under pressures no person was designed to withstand. McCain listened from his cell 3 doors down, recognizing the particular quality of Reisner's cries. This wasn't the sharp agony of physical torture or the exhausted sobbing that followed interrogation sessions. This was different, deeper, more fundamental. This was the sound of sanity breaking apart like glass under too much pressure. Vietnamese guards made no effort to stop the screaming. They understood that Reisner's breakdown served their purposes perfectly, creating a soundtrack of psychological destruction that would terrorize every other prisoner in the cell block. The message was clear. This could happen to any of them. Resistance had limits, and those limits could be exceeded. Reisner had been one of the strongest prisoners in the entire Vietnamese system. A decorated fighter pilot with years of combat experience, he had maintained perfect military discipline throughout months of torture and starvation. His sudden collapse sent shockwaves through the prisoner community, proving that no one was immune to complete psychological destruction. The breakdown followed a predictable pattern that Vietnamese captors had observed in dozens of American prisoners. First came the withdrawal. Rissner had stopped responding to tap code communications and ceased his daily exercise routines. Then came the talking to himself, muttered conversations with invisible companions that grew louder and more agitated over time. Fellow prisoners had tried to reach him through the walls, tapping messages of encouragement and solidarity. But Reisner had stopped responding weeks earlier, lost in an internal world that was becoming more real than the concrete cell that confined his body. The isolation had finally achieved its intended purpose: complete disconnection from reality and human contact. The screaming phase marked the final stage of psychological collapse. Reisner's mind, unable to process the accumulated trauma of months of systematic abuse, had simply shut down its higher functions. He was no longer a military officer, a husband, or a father. He had become a broken animal, howling in pain that transcended physical sensation. Other prisoners experienced different forms of mental breakdown. Commander Porter Haleyburton had developed a catatonic state where he would sit motionless for hours, staring at the concrete wall without blinking or responding to any stimulus. His mind had retreated so far inward that his body became an empty shell, breathing but not truly alive. The catatonic prisoners were perhaps more disturbing than the screaming ones. They had found a form of psychological escape that removed them completely from their circumstances, but at the cost of their essential humanity. Vietnamese guards would poke them with sticks, splash water on their faces, and shout commands, but the catatonic prisoners remained unreachable in their mental fortresses. Suicide attempts became increasingly common as prisoners reached their breaking points. Lieutenant Colonel Ted Guy tried to hang himself with strips torn from his prison uniform, but the fabric wasn't strong enough to support his weight. The failed attempt left rope burns around his neck and added another layer of humiliation to his psychological suffering. McCain discovered another prisoner, Major Fred Cherry, trying to beat himself to death against the concrete walls of his cell. Cherry's face was a mass of bruises and cuts from repeatedly slamming his head against the stone, but he continued the self-destructive behavior until guards intervened, not to help him, but to preserve him for further interrogation sessions. The self-harm attempts revealed the depth of despair that systematic torture could create. Death began to seem preferable to continued existence in the Vietnamese prison system. Prisoners who had once been willing to die for their country now wanted to die to escape their captors, a psychological transformation that represented the ultimate victory for Vietnamese psychological warfare. Vietnamese guards had learned to recognize the warning signs of complete mental breakdown. They would increase surveillance of prisoners who showed symptoms of impending collapse, not to prevent it, but to ensure they didn't lose valuable propaganda assets to suicide. The guards wanted broken prisoners, not dead ones. Fellow Americans became the primary caregivers for prisoners who had suffered complete psychological collapse. They would feed catatonic cellmates, clean up after those who had lost control of bodily functions, and try to maintain human contact with men whose minds had retreated beyond reach. Stockdale organized an informal support system among prisoners who were still mentally functional. They would take turns caring for the broken men, sharing their meager food rations and providing whatever comfort was possible in the brutal prison environment. This care network became another form of resistance against Vietnamese efforts to completely dehumanize their captives. The psychological casualties created additional moral burdens for surviving prisoners. Men who maintained their sanity felt guilty about their relative mental health while watching fellow Americans disintegrate. The randomness of who broke and who survived created survivor guilt that would haunt veterans long after their release. Vietnamese interrogators studied each breakdown carefully, looking for patterns and techniques that could be applied to other prisoners. They treated psychological collapse as a science, documenting which combinations of torture, isolation, and deprivation produced the most complete mental destruction in the shortest time. The broken prisoners served as living warnings to others about the consequences of continued resistance. Guards would drag catatonic or screaming Americans past other prisoners' cells, showing them the ultimate destination of their defiance. The sight of former military officers reduced to gibbering shells was more effective than any torture session at encouraging compliance. The breaking point revealed the true horror of the Vietnamese prison system. It wasn't designed to extract information or serve military purposes. It was a laboratory for psychological destruction, where human beings were systematically reduced to broken components through calculated applications of trauma that exceeded the mind's capacity to process and survive. February 12, 1973. The C-141 transport aircraft touched down at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, carrying the first group of American prisoners released under Operation Homecoming. John McCain stepped off the plane into blazing sunlight, his legs shaking so violently he could barely walk. The man who had weighed 180 pounds when shot down over Hanoi now weighed 105 pounds, his body a collection of improperly healed bones wrapped in translucent skin. American medical teams had prepared for the worst, but nothing could have readied them for the walking skeletons that emerged from those aircraft. These weren't the healthy, resilient military officers who had disappeared into Vietnamese prisons years earlier. These were broken men whose bodies told the story of systematic torture, starvation, and medical neglect that had lasted for nearly a decade. Dr. Harold Kushner, himself a former POW and Army doctor, examined McCain during the initial medical screening. McCain's arms hung at unnatural angles, permanently twisted from rope torture sessions that had dislocated his shoulders repeatedly. His hair had turned completely white, and his face bore the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had seen too much suffering to ever fully return to normal life. The medical examinations revealed the full scope of Vietnamese cruelty. X-rays showed bones that had been broken and rebroken, healing incorrectly without proper medical treatment. Stockdale's back injury had compressed his spine so severely that he had lost 3 inches in height. Denton's shoulder had fused in a position that left his arm permanently disabled. Weight loss was universal and extreme. Men who had been robust military officers now resembled concentration camp survivors. Their bodies had consumed muscle tissue and organ matter to survive the starvation diet of watery pumpkin soup and maggot-infested rice. Some prisoners had lost more than half their original body weight during their captivity. Tropical diseases ran rampant through the returning prisoners. Malaria, dysentery, and parasitic infections had weakened immune systems that would never fully recover. Many men suffered from vitamin deficiencies so severe they had caused permanent nerve damage, blindness, and cognitive impairment that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The psychological evaluations were even more disturbing than the physical examinations. Military psychiatrists documented symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety disorders that had no existing treatment protocols. These men had endured forms of psychological warfare that were beyond anything American medicine had previously encountered. Some returning prisoners couldn't sleep in beds, having spent years on concrete floors. They hoarded food compulsively, terrified that starvation might return at any moment. Loud noises sent them diving for cover, their nervous systems permanently damaged by years of living in constant fear of torture and death. The tap code had become so ingrained in some prisoners that they unconsciously tapped messages on tables, walls, and furniture during conversations. Their fingers moved in the familiar patterns even when they were trying to communicate normally. A physical reminder of the secret communication network that had kept them sane during isolation. Family reunions were simultaneously joyful and heartbreaking. McCain's wife barely recognized the broken man who returned to her. His children, who had been young when he was captured, struggled to connect with a father who seemed more like a ghost than the vibrant pilot who had left for Vietnam years earlier. Some families had moved on during the long years of uncertainty. Wives had remarried, believing their husbands were dead. Children had grown up with stepfathers and felt like strangers to the biological fathers who suddenly returned from the grave. The psychological warfare had extended beyond prison walls, destroying families as effectively as it had broken prisoners. The returning POWs faced a country that had changed dramatically during their captivity. The Vietnam War had ended in defeat and controversy. Anti-war protesters had sometimes characterized American servicemen as war criminals, making the prisoners' homecoming complicated and painful. They had suffered for a cause that many Americans now considered immoral. Media attention was overwhelming and often insensitive. Reporters wanted dramatic stories about torture and survival, but many prisoners couldn't discuss their experiences without triggering severe psychological reactions. The public's fascination with their suffering became another form of exploitation that complicated their readjustment to civilian life. Military debriefers spent months interviewing returning prisoners about their treatment in the Vietnamese prison system. The testimonies revealed the systematic nature of the torture program and provided evidence of war crimes that violated international law. But the detailed recounting of their experiences often re-traumatized prisoners who were trying to forget. Some returning POWs threw themselves into public speaking and political activism, using their experiences to advocate for strong national defense and support for military personnel. Others retreated from public life entirely, unable to cope with the attention and expectations that came with their survivor status. The medical treatment required for returning prisoners was extensive and often unsuccessful. Broken bones that had healed incorrectly required surgical rebreaking and resetting. Psychological therapy was primitive by modern standards, leaving many men to struggle with trauma symptoms without effective treatment options. McCain underwent multiple surgeries to repair the damage from rope torture, but his arms never regained full function. The physical limitations served as daily reminders of his captivity, making it impossible to forget the years of systematic abuse he had endured in Vietnamese prisons. The homecoming marked the beginning of a new struggle for survival, learning to live with the physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. The men who returned from Vietnamese prisons carried scars that went far deeper than broken bones and damaged nerves. They had survived a systematic campaign of psychological destruction that redefined the boundaries of human endurance. Their experiences changed American military policy forever, leading to enhanced survival training and international efforts to prevent prisoner abuse. If you want to see how these survivors rebuilt their lives after this nightmare, watch our video on McCain's political career. Subscribe for more untold stories of human resilience in history's darkest moments.